Here is the contents of what I'm going to be talking about today. I haven't included all projects that I have completed for this module for time reasons, but everything can be found on my Padlet, which is linked on the last slide. I'm going to start by talking about the key text that we read at the start of the module. After reading Chapter 2 by David Crow, I went back and looked through my work and realised that I actually used signs and symbols in my illustrations more than I thought. This was really beneficial to my practice and I'm starting to understand my process more. Since I'm really interested in comics and narrative, I also looked at Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. Throughout this presentation, I will explain why this book was so beneficial to my practice. More research and key reading can be found throughout my Padlet. My first project was inspired by Hourly Comic Book Day, which is this day on Twitter where lots of comic artists document their day and post it online. Here are some examples of artists that I follow and really admire. Inspired by this, I started documenting my own day. As you can see, all of my images on the top left-hand corner are heavily aided by text. This is when Rob set me the micro project to try and create a 2-page comic without any text to aid my illustrations. I started by documenting an embarrassing experience I had. I was then playing around with the layout to see if the story could work visually. Using this panel example from Scott McCloud, I also decided I would change the juxtaposition of my characters so it wasn't a full body shot, just to try and pull back my images. At this point, I still felt like my images were too heavy, so I wanted to strip them back even more. I really focused on just changing the facial expressions to try and create narrative that way. This is the final outcome for my 2-page silent comic. I played around with the typography for the title using the font from Doom, which is a video game where players assume the role of a space marine, popularly known as Doom Guy, fighting their way through hordes invading demons from hell. I thought this was a funny play on fighting my own demons through life, which in this case was an embarrassing interaction. Obviously, this only makes sense if you've ever played the video game Doom, but I just thought it was a fun way to play with the narrative. I also think stripping back the images and just playing around with the facial expressions and the rosy cheeks for being embarrassed really helped my comic and really helped convey what I was trying to say. This next project was in collaboration with the School of Art, where we designed tart cards for typography. I looked at Michael Perry's A Category of Hand Type as a starting point for this project. I really wanted to make some hand-rendered text as a reflection of the early tart cards being made by hand and then duplicated on a photocopier. Something I took from this book and really wanted to push in my own work was the idea of using my hands and having mistakes and quirks in the work. All of these qualities give the work warmth, which I kind of feel more humanises it a bit more, which was the idea of a tart card, there was a human at the end of the number. Before moving forward and making my text by hand, I decided to find some typography that I could be quite playful with. This typeface is called Giddy Up, and I used this because the curves reminded me of rope. I then took the shape of the typeface and then drew it out the text in rope, using the words all tied up and bound. All of the tart cards from my research had been really playful and didn't feel super serious, so I wanted that to reflect in my work too. I then did a quick collaboration with Franklin using one of his illustrations and my typography to make a tart card. On the bottom right hand corner are all the examples of the collaboration work. I feel like the combination of my research and the process really made this project successful. Moving forward to workshops, I started playing with the process a bit more. On the left is an image from my sketchbook, which is just a short narrative, again silent because that's something I'm focusing on. I then layered these images together on the risograph, just playing around with the idea of the process, layering. And then I cut them up and laid them out randomly just to see if the narrative still made sense, just to see if I could make images, just again, the idea of pulling things apart and putting them back together just to see if it makes sense or if I can make something from it, just again playing with the idea of process. After I attended a risograph workshop where I really allowed myself to be creative and experimental and have fun again with the process, the idea of just pulling things out of magazines, pulling things from my sketchbooks, putting them together just to see what happens. I personally feel like experimenting with the process is one of the ways that I like research. I'm also learning not to be precious with my work, so I was like ripping them in half, putting them back together, turning them upside down, and like experimenting what would happen. I then put these images through the risograph, experimenting with the idea of layering again and pulling stuff apart and seeing what I could make from this. At this point, I'm really starting to understand my own methodology when it comes to making visual language. I really feel like all of these experiments have been beneficial throughout all of my projects during this module, and it was really good to attend workshops and just experiment without the pressure of making anything at the final, but just enjoying the process of making. I then collaborated with an MA architecture student. The collaboration was about the process, teaching him how to use the risograph and layer his images and just to have fun. The combination of our work is really interesting. There is something really fun about the contrast between the sharp lines and the texture in my own work. I then showed him how to turn one of the A3 images we had made together into an 8-page zine. He is now using this in his own project. My next project was the Stratford Literature Festival book jacket competition. This was a live project. I had previously done book jacket covers in my bachelor's degree, but never really found them successful. So I really thought about how I was going to research this and how I was going to try and create something successful. I'd often found that I was making images and never really had a plan, so I decided to look at composition ideas from other artists, and then I created some thumbnails just to see if that would help me push forward and if that was one of the issues. Sadly, at this point, I did feel like my project wasn't going anywhere and I didn't really like the thumbnails I had created. So I went to It's Nice That and tried to find some contemporary practitioners and look at their methodologies to see if that could help me with my own project. I then discovered Caroline Hawkins, who talks about the tension between mechanical and handmade. Since all of my thumbnails were made digitally, I decided to go back to drawing traditionally and making things with my hands again, just to see if that was beneficial. There is more about what I learned on this article on Padlet. After reading that article, I really started playing around with like hand-rendered stuff again. I went to the print room downstairs and I printed out a load of letters, and after they dried I photocopied them, I enlarged them, made them smaller and bigger, and really like I cut them all out by hand and started layering them, just having fun with the process. And since the only requirement for the book cover was for it to be colourful, I then laid it on the risograph just to like layer the colours and see what I could come up with. I then thought about the word collection in the front cover, and then like decided to cut out these like the stick men holding hands as like a collective of people, and then I've got like the illustration of like them holding hands, which I feel like was like an interesting reflection, and I tried to make it as colourful as possible since the age group for this poetry book was 6 to 25-year-olds. I feel like that was a really good reflection, and my research really helped me like get there. This was the final outcome for the live brief. I made it in InDesign as well, so like putting all the pieces that I'd made handmade together in InDesign, and then I'd also done a mock-up of what it would look like if it was like an actual physical book to help put it into context and help you visualize how it would look. I then started looking at current practitioners that use their personal life and personal experiences in their own work. I found Jenny Hisso at an exhibition at the V&A about video games. Jenny Hisso uses prompts about her life to make video games and share the more challenging things about her life. She has made games about her eating disorder and one featuring how she looks. She uses this creative outlet to be able to talk about things and share things that are more challenging in her life. I won't play the video because it's 40 minutes long, but it is available to watch on my Padlet if you would like. I then started looking up a practitioner called Ruby Etc., who I'd seen in the Cartoon Museum. I'd found that she'd done this video on It's Nicer Tuesday and I'd watched it. In this video, she talks about how she finds comics as an approachable medium. It's easier for people to understand the the harder subjects. It's a good way of making huge intangible feelings into something that makes sense. From my research, I started doing a daily comic where I would reflect and look back on my day and document it, using this time to experiment with different materials and techniques such as gouache, watercolour, and even drawing directly onto photographs. I then started to try and pull my comics from the page. I tried to get them from their page prison, like trying to make them leave the page. I created a small collaborative zine with people I'd spent the day with, and then on the 4th of April I tried to illustrate my day in a more graphic way, inspired by Kentaro Okawara, a Japanese artist who uses very graphic images in his work. I'd also recently bought this sketchbook from Hatto Press, which uses cuttings of different shapes of paper, and tried to experiment with that. I then bound and created my own sketchbook and started to displaying the narrative in there. I'm really interested in like different ways of presenting narrative. I then started a collaborative project with Ethan. It was a silent narrative. This project was about two people meeting in the middle of the book, so it can be read from both front to back and back to front. I started by creating images in my sketchbook, trying to convey the idea of the character getting ready in the morning without using any text. I then used the process that I've been using throughout the module of like pulling my images apart and putting them together to create the narrative. As you can see, some process photos on the right. Obviously, at this point, the character is trying to get to the middle of the book where they meet the other character. So I wanted to convey the idea of movement. I then got the ideas from Scott McCloud's Creating Comics about the two images together that sort of like indicate movement and indicate time passing. So I used the girl standing next to a bike and then like the shoe next to the arrow just as signs. So it indicates her moving along with her day and moving towards her final place. Then going back on my work, I looked at Matt Madden's 99 Ways to Tell a Story. This book is really interesting. Obviously, as it says in the title, it's a one-page comic that tells a story in a variety of different ways, 99 ways. And some of them are like just by using text or the point of view of the main character. So I tried to recreate one of the panels I'd already done in like the main character's point of view, just to see how it would look, to see if I could create anything from that. So this is that experiment here. Obviously, since this is a collaborative project, we started thinking about how to combine our work and how to break up the images and how they would potentially be printed. So this was just experimenting with the layout. At the start of the project, we just had the two characters meeting at a train station, but then we did some primal research and we went to Natural History Museum and did some reportage illustration. I really like the idea of people being more connected to a story because they recognise the place or they have like past experiences in that place. So it's something we wanted to push forward with this project. That's why we changed it from a train station to the Natural History Museum. I also feel like the Natural History Museum is like an iconic place in London and like it's quite easily recognisable, especially if you are like British. But again, that could isolate an audience because if they'd never been to the Natural History Museum or never seen it before, it doesn't mean anything to them. So that was also something to consider, the cultural context of the Natural History Museum in our work. These are stills and screenshots from the middle pages of our illustration of our like narrative where everything was coming together. We had to obviously combine both of our images and our styles of work, and we played around with layout. Again, it was like the idea of like cutting things out and we're like messing around just to see how it looks, pulling things apart and putting them back together, but this time in a more collaborative way. And I feel like in the end we got to a place where it was like really highlighted both of our work. After being happy with the narrative, we then decided to try and print this on the risograph, playing around with colour and the layering of different colours to see what we could make from it. I really like the idea of layering the colours because it were like two stories combined. It was like two characters meeting up. So I feel like that was like really fun and playful. In the end, we decided to make it a a 6-page scene, but we also played around with the idea of maybe making like an origami heart and the narrative being out of the origami heart, and just again thinking of the process, thinking about different ways we can display the narrative. This is the first time I'd like collaborated with someone in such a big way where we made something together, and I feel like it was actually really successful. Moving forward, I would like to think about the narrative more than the process, but for like dipping my toe into like that whole world, I feel like it was a good start. This was another collaborative like live brief sort of project, which was the Palestinian Museum project. I started by doing some more reportage illustration, trying to like really get the feel of the concert and like trying to like really try and capture the evening. I then started thinking about how we can collaborate in a more practical way. So I had recently done a concertina book, and I thought it was a good way of like combining our work. And since the concertina is like in tiles, which really ties into like a lots of Palestinian buildings are like completely tiled, so I feel like it was like a really like a nice way to reflect that. And then on the right is the process of like mine and Johnny's sketches from the evening layered upon each other on the risograph, just to see if we could find anything interesting just to pull from that visually. I have a lot more images on my Padlet of the process of making each individual tile. Each tile is a song that was performed on the evening. I tried to capture the song and the lyrics in a respectful way, since it would be displayed in a museum, and I think like for the context and lots of people will see it, it has to be really appropriate. And so I tried to interpret lyrics from the songs and also the images that I had made that evening. I also put them through the risograph again. It's just the idea of like pulling my narratives apart and putting them back together until they make something cohesive. Finally, me and Johnny made an 11-page concertina publication where both of our work meets in the middle. He did the first 5 songs and I did the last 5, and then the 6th song in the middle is like a combination of both of our illustrations layered on top of each other. We used purple because there was a lot of purple lighting in the concert that night, so I feel like it was a really nice reflection on that. Moving forward with my project, I feel like I got into a place where I really started to understand my methodology and understand how I use visual language. And I think that make that very clear throughout the presentation and my Padlet. I understand that one of the ways that I research is by making the pulling images apart and putting them back together until I am satisfied with my visual language. Moving forward, I want to focus my research and practice on the narrative side more than the process. When I look at websites such as It's Nice That and read articles about artists, their work is always about the subject and the narrative and the things they want to talk about, not about how many Instagram followers they have and things like that. It's not them making art for the sake of making pretty things. They're talking to their audiences. Now that I'm happy with my own process making, I feel like I can put that research aside and start thinking about what I want to talk about and who my audience is. I really feel throughout this module, one of the main pieces of research that I always went back to was Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics. It really helped me strip back my images and think about what I was going to do. It helped me make considerable decisions in the design process. And when I talk about pulling things apart, it really helped me understand what I should take out and what I should put back in to make the narrative like easy to understand and make my project successful. Throughout this module, I feel like I've successfully been able to collaborate with my peers, starting to understand my design process and to be experimental with my mediums and techniques. Moving forward, I want to really think about the narrative and how to tell stories. Thank you for watching my PowerPoint. All of the research that I may have missed or couldn't include in this presentation because of time is available on my Padlet, and the QR code is just on this slide. Thank you.